Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Hopefully, you've been thinking about your business continuity plans this January. So I'm Martin Petts. I'm responsible for the business in UK and Europe. We also have Mike Wrightson, our Director of Product Management, on the line. I think that's it from me. At this point, I'm going to hand over to Mike Wrightson, our Director of Product Management. Mike, over to you.
Well, good day, everyone. Welcome to this presentation, Making BCDR Your New Year's Resolution. I'm Mike Wrightson. I am the Director of Product Management for IT Continuity Engine from Neverfail. And I just wanted to kind of introduce myself to you, give you a little background, just to kind of set the stage for the presentation. I've been with the company for about 4 years. I started as an SC. I've actually have a pretty extensive background in business continuity. This wasn't my first gig in the DR space, but it certainly has been the most enjoyable. So I came in as an engineer. I moved up to a senior level architect, and now actually run our flagship product, which is IT Continuity Engine. It's a very exciting time here at Artisan Infrastructure under the Neverfail brand. We have a lot of new capabilities with our technology, and and we bring a lot of experience to the table that we're going to share with you just momentarily. So to begin our presentation today, we're going to talk a little bit about our agenda, and there's really 5 areas in which we're going to present our case to you today for building a strong business continuity plan for disaster recovery. We're going to talk a little bit about the differences between BC and DR. So they're not the same, but we'll talk a little bit about some of the differences. We're also going to look at the experiences that some have had in recent times because of different events that have happened. So we'll take a look at that and how these affect people overall. Then we're going to move on to what causes some of the downtimes that we see today, and certainly with all the things that are going on in the world today, we can easily see why a lot of people are experiencing downtime. There's a lot of different reasons that outside of the disasters that cause applications and infrastructure not to be available. But then we're going to examine what the real cost of a disaster is. So, you know, we think of always in terms of infrastructure, but there's a cost to it. So we will actually cover those also very briefly. And then what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about how do we get ahead of the curve? How do we plan for this? How do we create a business continuity strategy so that you can be prepared for what is indeed is the inevitable, which is that a disaster will happen at some point. So it's not an if, it's a when. So to get started with our presentation, let's talk a little bit about the differences between disaster recovery and business continuity. So when you look at disaster recovery by definition is always reactive. It is a process by which you're trying to restore something that's been lost. And in the IT space, it's usually infrastructure of some type that has been lost, either an application or infrastructure or some type of service that is being generated by and managed by the IT infrastructure. So disaster recovery really is about covering and restoring critical systems in the event of a disaster, when it happens, after it happens, and providing the process to restore those applications. So it's again, it's about getting things back online once things have happened. So BCDR, our strategy does have a DR component, and certainly you want to be able to get those systems up and operational, but the flip side of that is that, you know, how can you become much more proactive with this? Well, that's where a business continuity strategy comes in, or we call it in the United States a business continuity plan, or BCP. So by definition, that business continuity plan really is more proactive. It's you're planning for the inevitable. So you're putting processes into place that and planning for them for the eventuality that something will happen. You will have a planned outage or a unplanned outage of some type. And you want to be able to limit those critical systems, the downtime that's there. So you're proactively putting processes and technologies in place to ensure that whatever happens in the background, that those critical systems will be available regardless of what actually happens. So when you're putting together a business continuity plan, there's a lot of detail that goes behind this, right? So, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. But the takeaway from this is that you can't look at these as the same. In fact, when you think about BCDR, the first thing you think of it's one and the same, but really they are completely different. One is proactive, so by building a comprehensive plan, you can then plan for the future and then be ready for whatever happens. The disaster recovery plan in and of itself is always reactive, so that when something happens, you know exactly what's there's a process for that recovery process. So when we talk a little bit about disaster recovery and business continuity, you have to look at how easy it is to have an outage of some type. When you look at the numbers here, and as over the last couple of years, there's really been a lot of studies done that actually will points to different areas in which we see more risk associated with certainly disasters that are happening. The first thing that you have to have is awareness. So executives really no longer can take a blind eye to the reality of the world that we live in. So we've seen, especially in the United States, and I live actually in the Northeast where we had Hurricane Sandy, a lot of people have said, well, if there's no real risk or there's a very low risk, why should we invest into something that we'll never probably take advantage of in the first place? So that mentality really leads to disaster in and of itself. So businesses are not always prepared for these events that are happening because of this perception. What are the perception? Well, there are different capital investments that have to be included with disaster recovery. And sometimes when we do these and we think that things are okay, that we haven't really tested them efficiently to see if it's actually going to work or not. And some even have ignored the threat. So they see, well, we had one hurricane in the last 5 years. If I have to spend $50,000, it's not really worth it to me to plan for the future. And then some, think it's absolutely too expensive. Oh, I'd like to do it, but I really think that $50,000 is too expensive for me, or whatever that number may be. So there's a lot of perceptions that we have from our executives in our organizations that we, as IT administrators, really have to dispel in order for them to get them on board, so that they realize the cost versus the risk. We also need to look at, if there is a risk to the business, what is the full impact to the business if we don't plan for the future? So statistics show that 20% of businesses without continuity plans will not survive the disaster. And give you an example. I live in the Northeast corridor. I used to actually live in Atlanta now, but I was there during 9/11. And after the disaster at the World Trade Centers, it was said on the news that 50% of the businesses that were in the World Trade Centers didn't survive. And it wasn't because their only office was in the World Trade Center. It was because their IT infrastructure wasn't built for disaster recovery. Nobody could imagine that somebody would take out these two magnificent buildings and all the company's IT infrastructure within it. So those 50% of those businesses didn't survive that entire incident. So So what did we see right after 9/11? Well, we saw a lot of companies building redundancy and data centers in New Jersey. So they had, the ones that did survive, they said, hey, look, this was a huge risk to us, and we had significant outages because of this disaster. So we're going to start spreading our risk across into New Jersey, and some of them even built 3 data centers, one in New York, one data center in New Jersey, and some of them even in Connecticut or even as far north as Boston. So there was some lessons learned from that disaster because of the loss, the heavy loss of business from the 9/11 attacks. And when we look at disaster as a whole, you can't really view this from an IT perspective. At the end of the day, everything revolves around people, right? So when a disaster happens, it always comes down to impact on people. Now, the IT itself and other aspects are the casualties of this. But if you look at the risk to people itself, over the last, from 1998 to 2007, the risk was of the impact on individuals, if you will, from disaster recovery was pretty much about even, if you will. It wasn't a lot of growth. But statistics have shown, and certainly I read a report a couple of weeks ago that from 2007 to 2015, we've now seen a huge increase in how people have been impacted by natural disasters. So you think about, these incredible, hurricanes that that we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years that have wiped out half of an entire country. So these things are really beginning to roll up and to impact many, many people. And if you look at this graphically on a sliding scale, the raw data, if you kind of graph it out, it's almost like a straight up arrow from 2007 to 2015. And if we stay on the same track, that means that we're talking about 325 million were affected just in 2015. But where are we going to be by 2020 or 2025? We could be into 400, 500 million people. So this is a big deal. This is something that we should be thinking about. And of course, if it affects people, it's going to affect business. So the question becomes, will it happen to me, right? And if we see what's going on in the world, we can see that it's not if, it's when. So to kind of give you some background, I live in Atlanta now. I just moved down here 3 months ago. And the church that I've gone to has repeatedly been bringing attention to disaster recovery preparedness for our families, for our whole households and our families. And this is not just here. This is also, they were starting to do this in New Jersey too. But essentially, disaster preparedness is becoming almost part of your household necessities. So our church is doing it, like maybe every 6 months or so. I'm getting brochures from our township and local municipalities on disaster preparedness. There is normal TV commercials on our local channels for recovery.gov, which is our federal emergency management in the United States. So there's a big awareness about these types of things that can happen, and it seems like 5, 10 years ago, nobody would be putting together this stuff. But as far as I'm concerned, I now have I've prepared my family for these incidents, because you never know what's going to happen, whether it's a hurricane coming up the coast, it could be massive flooding, it could be tornadoes, it could be anything. So especially after the major earthquake in Haiti, I really started preparing my family for this, and we put together, kits for, emergency kits, and setting aside things for clean water and food and clothing, so that we could move very, very quickly in the case of an emergency. So these things are what we call a business continuity plan. So you want to know if something happens, where to meet your family, where where are your relatives? Give them your family and friends in the neighborhood places where you're going to be in case certain things happen. What is a disaster recovery plan is having things like auto insurance, having your home insurance, things like that that allow you to recover from a disaster once it happens. So even our personal our personal lives, we have to have a BCDR, or a business continuity plan. So how much more do we need for our businesses? Because businesses again are affected by what happens with people. So we've seen it all, right? I mean, basically every day or every week on the news, we see terrible things happening in the world. We see, disasters in one place after another, power outages. After 9/11, I think it was about a year after 9/11, we had a huge power outage in the Northeast. Everybody thought another terrorist attack was happening. So we have these, the grid goes down. We have tsunamis, mass flooding events. The Carolinas, just maybe 2 months ago and a month and a half ago, we had a hurricane come up the coast, and it came on the shore right around North Carolina, South Carolina border, and it was a 500-year flooding event for the Carolinas. So it can happen. A lot of homes were destroyed. A lot of property was destroyed. We're starting to see more things. I mean, we're aware of the terrorism the things that are happening here, but in recent times, when you look at things like the Paris attacks and what's happening in what happened in Southern California with the militants doing a terrorist act where they did a mass shooting or whatever, we're starting to see other things that are happening now that can take out business services. So think about what happened in Brussels. An entire city was shut down because of the threat of an imminent terrorist attack. So when people can't get to work, that means that business is affected. Again, so a disaster is always related to people, and people affect the way we do business. So when a martial law is declared and people can't go to work, then, of course, business is impacted. To give you an example of how a disaster can really affect somebody, and even in places where you may not even, there hasn't been a disaster in 500 years. When I first came on board to Never Fail, we had an event in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, with one of our companies. They actually lost their entire data center to a 500-year flood in the middle of the desert. So once that happened, they called us and said, hey, look, can you help us to recover? And unfortunately, it was all their executives' mailboxes that were in the Jeddah, Saudi Arabia world headquarters. But they had a recovery site in Huntsville, Maryland. So they called us. They copied over, we implemented our technology. They copied it over to the recovery site in Huntsville, Maryland. And now they had a process to recover those servers instantly in the event of an emergency. So we shouldn't wait until the 500-year flood happens or whatever, but and be in reactionary mode. But plan ahead so that even if you don't think the 500-year event's going to happen, you are prepared for it regardless. So real quick, I mean, it's been a whirlwind of issues in the last few years. Strongest hurricanes in world history. I talk about the Philippines here, but the reality is that was the one that affected people. The biggest one happened last year off the coast of Mexico, and it was measured like I think the wind speeds were over 300 miles per hour or something. But the key thing is that it didn't affect people. It was in a very sparsely populated area that didn't affect people. So we didn't hear a lot about it, but the key is that things are getting worse. And God forbid that Mexican hurricane didn't hit like Southern California or maybe the Baja Peninsula or something where there was a lot of people there. But the key takeaway of this is that things are happening. They're happening at an increasing rate, and it doesn't matter what it is. It could be man-made or it could be a natural disaster. So now let's talk a little bit about the cost of these events, right? So we think about the impact of to the business, the lack of operations, the having to restore business services, and the impact to the people during the actual disaster while it's happening. We don't always think about the actual cost of this. So if you look at this, and if you look at this per company and over statistically, the statistics show that the companies lose about $84 per hour when there is a major disaster. Now, you may not think that's a lot of money per se, but that is the average of whether it is a onesie twosie mom and pop operation to a world global conglomerate. But so it ends up going from as little as $84 an hour all the way up to millions of dollars per hour that could be lost, depending on the type of business it is and what the criticality of the services that they deliver. So when you look at things like the RBS, incidents at Lords and certainly in HSBC, the losses piled up into the hundred of million, almost $200 million. So we can see that depending on what type of business it is, the losses can be very staggering. If you look at Hurricane Sandy on the East Coast, the total losses, whether it was property damage, businesses, everything, was about $325 million. So it was, or I should say, $235 billion. It was huge. And they contributed about a third of that to business losses. So if that's the case, you're talking about a little over $100 billion in business losses themselves. So it's a serious thing. So money is bleeding out because of improper preparations for disaster recovery. I had a good example of a customer in Washington about 3 years ago. They were a not-for-profit cancer research society, and they took all of their donations via the internet. So they had a web server, and of course, when we got the call from them, we didn't really understand the depth of their loss, but they asked us to come in on an emergency. They asked us to come in the next day and show us or demonstrate the technology and whatnot. But when we got there, we found out that their losses for the system, first of all, the system was down 3 days, and they lost about $70,000 a day in revenue because they didn't plan for the loss of that server. So, of course, we were able to help them. But, again, this is clearly, this was just a 60-person operation. $70,000 a day in donations was lost. So their 3 days before they could get the system back up, their losses were about $200,000 or more. Okay, so the question becomes if we know that this is inevitable, how can we prepare for this? So the first thing that I always say is that you need to provide management with assurances that the plan that you're going to put in place is verified to work. And the way we do that is we test, and we test more until we get it right? So one of the things that, when I talk to customers, they ask me is that, well, we're afraid to fail. We want to test, but we're afraid to have this failure. And I always tell them, don't be afraid to fail a DR test. Be afraid to pass and miss something that was critical. So if they miss something that was critical, and because they didn't do the analysis or they didn't understand all the systems that are there, that's actually worse than failing their DR test. A DR test is exactly that. It is designed for you to learn from this. So as you continue to test and test and test, you will refine your process, you will get it right, and then you will get to a point where you are very comfortable in the fact that this is right. So some companies will test 6 months, some test every 3 months. I have a company that's a never fail customer that tests every 2 weeks. They migrate their workloads between different data centers every 2 weeks. That's how paranoid they are. So it's a great thing because they're able to prove to their management that it's verified to work. And just to give you an idea of just an example of how you should view this, right? So if you look at, if you're an entrepreneur and you're a startup, statistically, an entrepreneur will fail a business financially 80% of the time, and that's usually the normal statistics. A new entrepreneur with a startup company, 80% of them usually fail in the first year, right? But when that entrepreneur learns from that scenario or learns from that experience, and next time he comes up and starts a new business, believe it or not, that statistic drops by about 50%. So the next time, only 40% of those will fail. And then the third time, 20% fail. So notice that, test, test, test. Keep doing this, and you refine the process, and the risks get lower and lower. The next thing is that you want to dispel the high costs of BCDR. So again, this is an executive thing, right? And it's our job as IT administrators to be able to go in and be able to tell our executives that we do have different options that are affordable that we can put into place that we can leverage to protect the business. So the perception is always that that it's expensive, and this can make or break your business continuity plan. But what you want to do is you want to go through the analysis process to ensure that all the different options that are available, that you can price them out, or at least get estimates for them, and then make a wise decision based on that so that you can build a fully viable and cost-effective business continuity plan. And don't wait until the entire plan is in place, right? So you can start with the most critical systems, because if you don't, it's kind of like you're playing with the survivability of your company, right? So getting those critical systems protected first while you're building a fully fledged business continuity plan is not only necessary, but it's almost you have to do this, right? So don't be afraid to start with the core components of your central infrastructure, maybe that are the most important to keeping the business operational while you're working on building this business continuity plan. And finally, leverage the experts. Get people who have years of experience with this, whether it's local partners, companies like Artisan Infrastructure with the Never Fail brand, whoever it may be. Leverage the experts to get them to help you to build this plan, because they know a lot of, they've been through this, they know all the details that go into this, they know how to go through the process of properly building a comprehensive plan. So how do we build that comprehensive plan? So there is a lot of detail that goes into this, but there are very high-level things that you really need to think about. First of all, is you want to build a tiered approach to application RPOs and RTOs. So what is an RPO and RTO? Well, it is essentially what you're prepared to lose in a continuity event, right? So from an RPO perspective, that's the recovery point, which means how much time can go by or data that can be afforded to be lost before you recover your data, right? The recovery time is actually just that. It's how fast can I get it back online. But if you look at this and build up a tiering approach to it, where I kind of use a model of 1 through 4, 1 being the most critical, 4 being the least critical, if you lose a tiered model approach to this, you're going to be just fine. That way, you can then go back and you can determine the technologies that you need to build SLAs. So what is an SLA? Well, it's just a service agreement, right? Service level agreement. That essentially allows you to put a value to each application in your infrastructure and assign a technology that will allow you to meet those SLAs, right? So that approach gives you the ability to now segment what's more important to you over a tiered approach, and then apply the right technology that allows you to get to that, to the SLA that you're committing to. One of the big things that you need to think about, and this is, I'm going to give you an example of this. After Hurricane Sandy, we had a customer that had a business continuity plan, executed it, was down for almost a month because he was in Lower Manhattan and it was completely flooded in Lower Manhattan. They failed over to the DR site, so their IT infrastructure was up and running. But while they were actually going through this event, they started getting calls from the business itself, different business units, and saying, hey, look, we can't operate because there are this application we own that are in your data center that you can't get to in New York, or we have these applications. One of the applications was the payroll system. So what they forgot to do is when they built their disaster recovery plan or their business continuity plan, they forgot the interdependencies between all the applications. They focused in on the central infrastructure. So this became a big problem for them. And one of the things, as I said, is the payroll system. They couldn't pay anybody for almost a month. So it was until they got back into the building and brought up the original data center. So this kind of spawned out a new project to kind of fill those gaps in the areas of interdependency. So it is a big part of your business continuity plan. So, and then, again, you want to determine what the critical systems are, the non-critical systems, and then certainly add them into your tiering approach. Then you want to determine how you can test your plan. You want to make sure that you can determine the viability of it. And finally, you want to analyze the cost, right? So you want to be able to determine what is it going to take for us to do this, right? So you want to compare doing it on-prem versus cloud. So there's a lot of different things that you have to look at as far as the costs are concerned. So this kind of gives you an overview of what is required to build a continuity plan. We see a lot of companies now are taking this seriously. They are building these continuity plans over time. It doesn't have to be, flash tomorrow morning, it's all in place. A true business continuity plan takes time to accomplish. So there's no time like the present. Start with your most critical systems. Get things there taken care of. You could always go back and make adjustments to that and expand the continuity plan into this tiering approach that we just talked about. So you can incorporate the entire business and all of its interdependent applications. So that's kind of the highlight of our presentation today. At this point, I wanted to take some questions from the audience, and I'm going to hand it back to Zach to gather some of the questions that the audience has submitted.
Did we get anything, Zach?
Yeah, we got a couple of good questions that came in. One of the first ones, and this probably goes back to testing your disaster recovery plan. They said, we have a disaster recovery plan, but it's quite old. How often should we be testing our DR plan?
So that's a great question, and it really kind of depends on the business, right? So like I said, we have customers that will do it once a year. We have customers that will do it 6 months. I have a lot of them that do it every 3 months, and I even have a few that do it every few weeks. So it really just depends on how you want to approach this, and and the criticality of those systems to the survivability of the business. So if you feel that there are different applications that if we don't get these off the ground within an hour or 2 hours or a day, the business is done, then I would suggest that you do your testing more often. I'll tell you, I mean, I'm always the type of person that is in favor of more than less, right? So as I said in the previous slide, test. I would say is if there are critical applications that you can't live without them, test them more than maybe some of the less critical applications. But the critical thing is that the testing process should refine your business continuity plan. So over a period of time, you should be able to backfill some of the issues that you're seeing here, and through that tiered approach, and systems tiered into different service levels, those can also help you determine when your testing periods are. So, I'll give you an example. We have one customer that, that will do all of their tier 1 applications every 3 months. Their tier 2 is, every 6 months. They do the tier 3 and tier 4 once a year, right? So they'll have like one big disaster recovery test in January or whatever it is. So again, it's really up to you. It's up to you to decide based on the criticality of those applications when those testing this. And I'm always in favor of more, instead of less.
Great answer, great answer. And we have a couple other questions that came in as well. One of the questions is, and I'm sure this has to go off of the expertise section, says, do we need to hire a team to do this? How hard is this to get started?
Well, it starts with a desire, right? So it's and a commitment from management to do this. So if there's a commitment, then even a single person can begin the process. So the process begins with identification of the most critical applications and their dependencies. You don't need a whole team of people to do that. But what you do need is a team of people to implement the actual continuity plan itself. So whether it takes you a month or 2 months or 6 months to put the continuity plan together, once you do that, then you can go to the experts and bring them in as you need them through the development process of the business continuity plan to augment the knowledge that you need. So if you don't have an understanding of what type of protection technologies that I can put into my tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, then you bring in that expertise as you need it and backfill. But you don't really need to have an entire team of people dedicated to this. It could be evolved over a period of time, and you can bring in the resources you need when you need them.
Awesome, Mike. Thanks for that answer. And then this next one is one I'm sure you hear all the time. This question is, we back up our data. Shouldn't we be safe in the event of a disaster?
So again, it comes back down to the tiering approach, right? So every tier has an SLA associated with it, and every SLA is designed for to deliver a recovery, if you will, for an expected service delivery, right? So backups are considered to be, to me, a tier 3 or tier 4 type of approach, right? So usually, and especially if you have a lot of application servers, think about what it would take for you to take all your tapes, and even if it's like a disk backup system at your recovery site, and restore all of those servers. It's going to take you hours, and if you have hundreds of servers, it could be days to get it up and running. So for certain types of applications that are very critical to you, you need a different approach for recoverability. So there's different technologies. There is backup technologies that offer, recoverabilities of a day or so. There are other technologies like, continuous data protection models that bring that in closer to hours instead of days. There are other systems that, other technologies that provide real-time recoverability that are in, minutes, maybe certainly less than 30 minutes recovery. And then there's others that provide you either real-time recovery or no downtime at all. But all of those have different costs associated with them, and they're directly associated with the criticality of those systems. So can backup get you back up and running? Yeah, it could. But it depends on how long you plan to be down and how much you can endure, and as far as a loss to your business or not. So if you have an ERP system that kind of drives the entire business, and you're taking transactions or you're doing e-commerce stuff, certainly you don't want to wait 2 or 3 days for all your backups to happen, or to get all your restores in place and build brand new servers in order for all that stuff to come online. Those would require a technology that is more real time, where you have either zero downtime or certainly recovery times of seconds to minutes. So again, it's about categorizing those applications assigning a value to them, to your business, and then assigning the right recovery tools for it to get them back up and running.
Great. And finally, our last question was actually directed towards me, and it was, will this webinar be recorded? And yes, it will be, and we'll be making sure to follow up with each of you after the recording and sending out the link so you guys can send this out to all of your peers as well.
Okay, so if that's the end of the questions, I'm going to hand this over to Martin for some final words.
Thanks very much, Mike. That was fantastic. So yes, as part of this webinar, we are offering a free business continuity health check. So we're actually going to send out some information in an email about this after the webinar, but this could include an on-site visit or remote session to do the health check. It will involve an analysis of all critical activities, an explanation of business continuity life cycle processes, a discussion around ICT, data, people, premises, suppliers, and an appraisal of risk analysis and risk assessment processes. So a pretty comprehensive health check will be available. So as I say, we're going to follow up with an email with the information on how you get that. And as Zach just said, we'll send out a link to the recording of this webinar. So that's pretty much for today, for this webinar, but we will be having webinars in the future, so please keep an eye out for our future webinars. Thanks again so much for dialing in, and bye for now. Thanks very much.